The Moashat people of Nootka Sound had their main village at Yuquot, and that was facing the open ocean, protected by a rocky prominence. But the fur traders and explorers coming up that coast, including Captain Cook in 1778, stopped at the village of Yuquot, and it became a major trading center. They also had a very rich visual history because of the people who came with naval expeditions, trained artists who made detailed records of the people and the village and the activities that were going on there. So it is a particularly long record for any visual history on the coast. When Cook came into the Nootka Sound area, he was greeted by a canoe load of people who were very anxious to trade with him. And he had with him an artist, John Weber, trained artist, who was actually Swiss. And Weber did a drawing of this canoe full of people, men and women, one man holding up some of the items they had for trade to the Europeans. One man, as you'll notice in the drawing, has a whaler's hat on. Many of them are wearing either cedar bark cloaks or sea otter fur cloaks. So it's quite a variety of people who are there in that first spotted trading canoe. The artist did a remarkable job of recording the interior of the houses. So again, it's one of the few places on the coast where we have really detailed drawings of what went on in these big log plank houses. And as you can see in this drawing, there are very small fish, candlefish, so-called oolakan fish hanging in rows from the rafters. And there are also bigger fish of various sorts and things like octopus and so on. So it's a real panorama of the activities of preserving food in the boxes that are lined along the walls, and also showing the plank partitions forming family units between the big house posts of the house, and fabrics and other things draped over the poles that were like drying racks around the fireplace. The exterior views are also very good, particularly the original drawings, of which this is one by John Weber. This map shows the cove on the left side of the picture. There is a rough, rocky beach, and on the right side, a big, long, sandy beach. And it was on the long, sandy beach where the main village was located. And it was a very ancient shell midden, going back several thousand years. It was excavated by Parks Canada in the 1960s, and they obtained radiocarbon dates on whaling more than 1,000 years ago that demonstrate that that was an important practice, an important reason for having the site in that locality. The rocky shoals also offered defensive mechanisms and a good staging place for a fort. And in fact, the Spanish also built their fort later on those rocky islands offshore. Again, we see the shell middens here, just big heaps of earth, but those are shell middens up to 15 feet in depth, accumulated over many centuries of living on that site. Here we see a party from the Cook expedition in 1778, coming ashore and trading with people who are there in the village. This is the first Indian Affairs map of the village, and we can see the houses and even small little sheds that line the beach in Friendly Cove. And the rock, as it's labeled here, is where the fortification was. The map has slightly turned from the previous one, but you can see the inner coast is where the blue arrow is pointing to the village site. And then the other outer coast and the word cemetery, where the dead were taken into tombs along that shore, and also the lake, which is where the island in the center held the whaler shrine. So here we see another map, which is worth detailed study because it shows the exact location of the Moashot village, of the Spanish settlement, whaler shrine, the fort site, which is K. C is the fort site, and there are various cairns, historic cairns there, and H, which I talk about later, is Lord Willingdon's pole, which was down at the very end of the village, and the Catholic Church, I, which is still there today. Here we have a more detailed view of the buildings that were there when this map was drawn by the Moashot man for a submission of the Whaler Shrine as a National Historic Site. Weber was a fine artist in my view, and also Surya was another excellent artist who drew some of the personages, including Chief Maquina wearing a whaling hat of spruce root and with the designs of whalers on it. And the wife of Maquina is also shown wearing one of these hats, and she has a cedar bark cape on. And here we have Ambrose Maquina, Chief Maquina. He was the fifth since his ancestor, whose picture is on the left. And on his left is Mike Maquina as a young man, and he was the sixth in line from the Maquina who greeted Captain Cook. A little more recent view of them. Chief Ambrose Maquina passed on more than a decade ago, and Mike is now the leading chief of the Moashot at Yuquot. I find this a particularly interesting drawing by Tomas de Suria, who was one of the Spanish contingent in 1792 at Yuquot and drew a lot of very fine portraits. This, however, is a Weber drawing, but showing the use of face painting. These are later prints, but done from drawings of the 1790s with men in a full outfit of cedar bark with decorative trim on it and a kind of bark cloak headdress. And the female version of this with a separate cloak over her shoulders and a cedar bark skirt and wearing a whaler's hat. Another very sensitive Weber portrait with, again, extensive face painting. And a woman of Nootka Sound who is wearing a northern style painted hat. And this is one of another Spanish artist who drew many portraits of people and spent a lot of detail on the clothing. Yuquot Seal Hunter by Weber, with his bow and arrows in a quiver and wearing a sea otter skin cloak and a whaler's hat. Edward Curtis did many portraits much later, in around 1910-12, in the Yuquot area. And here, a woman wearing a woven cedar bark kind of hood. This is a view of the Spanish establishment from 1788 to 1792. The Spanish had a post at Yuquot, and here we see behind the ship, the hulk that is in the foreground, a round tent, which was an observatory tent. And there are other log buildings, very different from the traditional style of the Moorshot. The photography is particularly rich and rewarding in the 1880s, the 70s, the visit of the rocket, and some of the sailors who were there, and some of the sailors from the rocket who were examining the village. You can see the huge planks used to close off the houses and the house frames. Here the houses are pretty well stripped. Perhaps this is just after the decimation of the population by smallpox and so on. So it may be the village is mostly abandoned, or it might be seasonal abandonment. Again, we can see that the canoe sheds on the beach still have planks, but the big houses have been totally stripped of their siding. And some of the drawings of the Spanish fort again show that there were ships that were either built or repaired on shore, and that all of the Spanish areas had fences around them, which is atypical of indigenous villages. And it appears that the Spanish more or less pushed the other occupants out of the village while they were occupying it. That's just a shore scene. And here's a scene in which there's dancing going on the beach. So there were quite a number of potlatches and various feasts held while the Spanish and the English were there. The Nootka incident was one that brought Europe almost to war. And the Yuquot, or the Moorshot people themselves, were very warlike. They traded and made war up and down the coast. And we see here a man standing in the far canoe who is wearing a suit of wooden armor. And in fact, we have some of those suits of armor that Cook and others collected and took back to Europe. So we have a very close study of the armor of the day. And in fact, a lot of the weapons were collected. The ball-headed club at the top is a recent purchase by Michael O'Dane as a donation for the Royal British Columbia Museum. The one on the right is one of the Cook pieces that is now in the British Museum. Shore scenes where people are coming back from a sea otter hunting expedition. And again, interior views, reworked by other artists later on. And you can see how they become more stylized. This is actually one of the Weber drawings, so it's actually quite precise. And the baskets still look like baskets rather than cockle shells. And we see that strange whale fin at the end of the line where the men are sitting, inset with sea otter teeth, which is the prize given to the leading whaler when they bring back a whale. A model of one of the house posts that is in the Berlin Museum that matches very closely the drawings, which otherwise look quite grotesque, but the carvings indicate that that is what the artists were seeing, or quite close to it, when they were doing those drawings. Nice little detail of how the planking on the sheds and the houses were arranged, and rather casual scenes of hunters coming back from their hunting expedition. This is the cook ships in the harbor in Nootka Sound, and some of the canoes coming, and some threatening activities, but there were never all-out battles in the area. And this is a kind of wrestling match. There's a long description of what went on here. You can see there are a group of European men at the standing next to the stage where the wrestlers are, and other Nuu-chah-nulth men standing in a painted stand where they can get a good view of the proceedings. There are a number of renderings of this with the village houses along the background. And here's the Spanish occupation again, with a two-story building with verandas and very Mediterranean style of house, and the compounds that go with that. This is an insult to the flag, as it was called. It was the beginning of the Nootka incident, which did lead to enough animosity to send delegations from both Spain and Britain to Yuquot and Nootka Sound, and they had a lot of difficulty resolving the issues, but they finally did that, and war was avoided. The village is in the light green area in this view, and you can see the red roofs of the lighthouse complex on the rocks in the foreground. And then the lake there's one lake, but it looks like two in the background, where the Whaler's Shrine is located. Here we have Cook's ships coming into Friendly Cove and being brought into shore by the smaller ships of the Spanish. And this is the Spanish fort. It looks like a stone fort up on the top, but it was probably just made of wood. And again, you can see the house with the porticos and the veranda in the background. This is a Gordon Miller painting looking from the seaward side into Nootka Sound, with the Spanish ships in the harbor area. And the backside of that big building with the porticos is in the center of the picture. But it does look as though there might be some Nuu-chah-nulth houses in this arrangement as well. And in 1793, after the incident was over and the Spanish had withdrawn, the British did construct some ships, one in particular, the Great Northwest America, rather, being ready to launch, with all the local people coming to watch the launch of this ship. And you can see here where the house row and the main kind of street through the village occurred. And another view of Yuquot from the air. The outer beach with the ocean to one side, there are whales that can often be seen coming up this shore. And here we have two of the women of Yuquot in cedar bark clothing, as photographed by Edward Curtis around 1912. One of the Maynard pictures that shows the old village site in the background, and the rocket ship. Standing inside one of these frames, you can see there's a big sea lion sculpted post that holds up the main roof of the house. And another view of the period. And this is a group of whalers who have just come in, European ship in the background. A rather rare picture of a whaling crew in the early days. And these are some of the people living in Yuquot when Maynard did his photography. Here we can see the two important houses. On the left is Chief McQuinn's house with a big painting on the house front and a shed roof, whereas the other ones are all linear buildings. The two of the important chiefs with the gable structure facing the beach, which designates them as people of importance. And on the right, towards the end, second to last house, again a gable roofed house with a big beam sticking out, is Captain Jack's house. So here we have McQuinn's house with the painting in this picture. You can also see their gardens and a lot of fish drying racks, which was a main activity, economic activity. A little more detailed picture of a human flanked by two lightning snakes in this tondo or round painting on the front of McQuinn's house. Here's the chief, as often wearing sailor captain's uniform traded from the Europeans. And that house is on the left behind the drying racks. You can see the pointed gable. And then following down to the end, you can see the beam sticking out of the front of Captain Jack's house, which is, it says McQuinn here, but it's Captain Jack, with a large dragon-like figure, lightning snake. Here we are as well. So this should be labeled Captain Jack. And there's a quite elegant figure of the chief below the lightning snake. And here's a more detailed view of it. Is now in the Royal BC Museum, although the lightning snake head was not preserved or collected. The main figure of the chief shows that the sculptural style is very sophisticated. So this was a favorite house for photography. And here you can see they have two doors, which often was the mark of a high chief's house, and a series of windows, and a little platform in front of the house. So again, a view from the east end of the town, showing both McQuinn's house and Captain Jack's house. Later on, other buildings took the place of those houses. And so we see here is Captain Jack's house with a totem pole in front of it. These were the first poles to be put up outside. All the other major carvings were on the inside of the houses. So here we have two parts. It was a very tall pole, so I had to divide it in two, the bottom half and the top half. And another view of yet another one of the poles. And they were tourist attractions from the beginning. We can see here tourists coming ashore with the poles in the background. And again, the far end of the village with the poles and masts marking the chief's house at the end. Another detail of the poles that were there. One of the poles was presented to the Governor General Willingdon on his visit to the village. And a picture taken inside Captain Jack's house showing his carvings, which would be part of displays at a potlatch. They're not structural, they're not holding up the roof. Just another one from offshore, showing the rocky protection at the end of the village. And here is Napoleon McQuinn in 1914 with a painted screen in the background and wearing an eagle helmet. And another picture of Captain Jack's pole at the base with some visitors and a local young man. And Chief McQuinn's pole with a whale at the base and a thunderbird and whale motif. And here is another view of that pole and the top of the pole. And some details taken fairly lately. Emily Carr did a watercolor of the pole, which we see here. And that's Captain Jack's pole towards the end of the village. A detail of the bear at the base of the pole. And another of the midsection of the pole, east end of town, showing a lot of activity on the beach. The pole eventually fell and is just pretty well disappeared in the underbrush. I took that picture 20 years ago, and it's deteriorated a lot since then, apparently. And here's a picture of the lighthouse and the village site now with no houses on it. There are a few structures, including the church, and a few houses are being built there again. Interior of the church with Captain Jack's interior house posts inside the church. Presumably after he died, they were moved to the church. And in fact, this is a set of similar monuments that were made for Chief McQuinn, and they were recarved fairly recently. Here we can see them in their recarved form. Parks Canada had them done for the National Historic Site interpretation at Yuquot. And here's the church from the distance, from the outer beach, where the center for potlatching, not as common as among the Kwakwaka'wakw, but some of these verandas were also used in ceremonies among the Nuu-chah-nulth. More detailed version of Jack's pole with the signboard that was once on the pole, being a double-headed sea serpent, would appear to be that. It did fall away. Other pieces fell off some of the poles, the beak from this bird. When Cook arrived at Yuquot, he noted in his journal house front painting and described it. And from that description, the Museum of Civilization had a competition among Nuu-chah-nulth artists only to reconstruct that monument. And so the one in the background here is by Ron Hamilton. And this was the initiation of the Grand Hall at the Canadian Museum of Civilization in 1989. The cemetery is along the outer shore, and the main monument there was this monument to Chief McQuina. The pyramid in the back was covered with strips of blanket and represented Mount Kanuma, which is in the backdrop to this monument as well. And it has a thunderbird with lightning snakes painted on its wings and holding a whale. And the whale is partly covered with an actual Chilkat blanket. This is what the cemetery looked like along that shore, outer shore. And there were many graves there, and very often masks and other figures were put on the grave. Here we see a bicycle pump and a tank for gas of some sort, and lanterns and an effigy of a big goose that were placed on the graves, and even a little cannon to the right. And sometimes the interior posts were taken and put, and this is one of the posts of Captain Jack with the lightning snakes and the salmon on top. Not sure who this one belonged to, but it's another post from an interior ceremony, no doubt, that was then later used on the grave of that chief. And most spectacular and unique is the whalers' bathhouse, the whalers, which is a place for went out on the hunt. And the figures are all those of known, important, successful whalers. So in a sense, the gallery is of whalers of the past. And in fact, even their skulls are there in the whaler's house. Some detail of the contents of that house. And here are some of the effigies. A whale, the tail is pointing towards the viewer. And some appear to be like doorways with entrance between the legs of the whalers. We don't know how these were used, but there is a fair bit of description of the rituals that went on. It was collected for the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and so there is a repatriating the whalers' shrine. It was located on this little island in the middle of the lake, not far from the village. And here is a whaler in the shrine when George Hunt collected it around 1910. It was still maintained to a large extent. and just some of the effigies in wood, and it's had a lasting result in the contemporary artists, including this one that Joe David did, which is his interpretation of a whaler's post. And you see at the base carved skulls and a whale. And that is it.